All right, folks, a real treat today, welcoming back to our studio, or rather our virtual studio here. You're in your studio, Lauren Taylor, up in Greenville, South Carolina. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Well, thank you for having me back.
No doubt. We appreciate you coming on. First of all, just want to thank you again, Lauren, for those of you who weren't following our Murdaugh coverage, provided just some incredible insights in the run-up to the big retrial hearing for Alec Murdaugh that was held last month in Columbia, South Carolina. Lauren and I actually attended that hearing together. And so watching that with you and your analysis and insights after that, just can't thank you enough. But Lauren, let me ask you, before we dive into some of these other cases we're going to be discussing, I wanted to ask you real quick, in the month since that hearing, since Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial was shot down so decisively and immediately by former Chief Justice Jean Toll, what's your thoughts been? Has there been anything from that hearing that stuck out from you that we should be on the lookout for, certainly from a legal standpoint, as that appeals process moves forward?
I think that obviously all of us have been marinating on what happened on January 29th, I believe it was. I think the process is moving forward. The most notable thing I think that you've been reporting on are the things we're seeing with Becky Hill's cell phones plural, and what is coming up of that. I mentioned when you and I were on Fox Nation together right after the hearing that I thought, now that the state does not need Becky Hill for their purpose of denying this motion for a new trial, I think you're going to see them pivot to her and start treating her a lot more like a criminal defendant is treated, not so much like a clerk of court would be treated. And I think the wheels of that justice are starting to pick up speed based on some things we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Absolutely. She went from star witness to prime suspect in all these different investigations. Let's just real quick, let's talk a little bit about what's happening with Becky Hill. Obviously, you referenced some of the news that came out last week. She's the focus of a multifaceted investigation by the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division. They're looking at obstruction of justice potentially. They're looking at misconduct in office. They're obviously looking at the jury tampering allegations, but a new one that's been thrown into the mix, potential perjury charges. Now, Lauren, you were in the courtroom. You heard Becky Hill's testimony on the stand when she was being questioned by Dick Harpootlian and by former Chief Justice Jean Toll. What part of that testimony could they possibly be looking at based on what you heard?
Well, I think you and I actually discussed it the day of outside the courthouse, that perjury charges could be rolling down the hill towards Miss Hill. I think there were several instances that came out during her testimony. The first was dealing with the media's access to certain exhibits that were, supposed to be hidden from them. I think there were some questions that it wasn't explained to the people that were sitting in the courtroom exactly where Justice Toll was going down that line of questioning or what evidence she had that disputed what Becky was saying. But I think subsequently we've seen that undoubtedly, especially with the most recent release of the context of some of her emails and text messages, we've seen it come to light that there was definitely more of sharing than what was portrayed. And then the second thing she also testified was, disputing the previous written record as far as what Judge Newman had said, as far as her questioning the juror prior to him being able to. So I and you discussed it right away that we thought perjury charges were going to be something hanging in the balance. And that's always at risk when she chose not to assert her Fifth Amendment. We'll see, I guess. I think a lot of the things that are being shown with the messages that are coming out is just, she thought she ran the show and she was wielding a power that was unchecked by pretty much everyone that had the ability to do it. So seeing these things come out where she's not just necessarily, favoring the prosecution under her guise of a murder conviction will sell more books. She was dallying in, things she shouldn't have been doing as far as the defense witness that was concerned, I believe the AV guy, and really bending over backwards to make things happen for whatever motive she might have had. I don't know that we can, get inside her head there and say that it was all for a conviction, but she certainly had a reason for it.
Well, and some of the messages that she exchanged with that contractor you were just mentioning that were released just this past week, they coincided with the timing on some of the same statements she allegedly made to jurors. I think that was sort of the value of it, but they also kind of exposed her. You mentioned being a little power hungry, perhaps running the show, but also a little catty. Some of those messages were, and it makes you wonder what else is going to come out. What other text threads have people saved on Miss Becky?
Exactly. I think it's also interesting to note that the timing of when this information was released, SLED apparently took possession of a phone. We don't know if it was the phone in question they were looking for or one that had been wiped back to factory settings, but they did that the day before the hearing, I believe. So, it doesn't bode well to those of us that are really arguing on the part of transparency in the judicial system. It looks like, there might have been some things they found and they're conveniently not turning them over or waiting to turn them over until after a decision has been made that results in, favorably for their side.
Right. And also the other thing that I found very interesting, it has now been confirmed beyond any shadow of a doubt that this investigation is being run by the state grand jury, by Creighton Waters' office, the same outfit that prosecuted Alec Murdaugh. And a lot of folks have asserted that that's a conflict of interest, but clearly a lot more to come on that as the Becky Hill investigation continues to ramp up, as you just mentioned, on multiple different fronts. We're going to keep track of that. But Lauren, you've been following a case out of the state of Michigan. That's my wife's home state. She's a 9-miler out of Detroit. But this is a case involving a 15-year-old at the time, Ethan Crumbley, committed what at the time, again, the most deadly school shooting in Michigan history, killed 4 people at the Oxford School. And you've been following this case because it's not just Ethan Crumbley that's on trial. There was a trial earlier this month for one of his parents, and it has opened up just this huge can of worms, set this huge new precedent. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this case because you've been following it very closely. Walk us through the charges that have been leveled against the parents of Ethan Crumbley.
Right. So the most important thing is that Jennifer and her husband are both charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Ethan killed 4 people that day. He also injured 6 others. So when we're talking about what standards the legal world is going to apply to something like this is the first time we've seen a parent be criminally liable for the actions of a child or another person. So when we're looking at any kind of, statute that relates to negligence, which is what they were able to charge her with involuntary manslaughter, was under gross negligence. So any legal analysis is pretty much the same across the board. You have duty, breach, causation, and damages. So the first peg of that would be a duty. So what the state is arguing is that as the parent of Ethan, she had a duty to make sure that, his mental health was taken care of. He was in a safe and, secure home. She had a duty to make sure that that child did not go out into the world armed with a weapon she provided and, create a mass shooting and take 6 or 4 lives. I apologize. So that would be the duty part of it. The breach is where she obviously allowed those things to happen. She bought him a gun. She bought him weapons. When the school tried to intervene and call parent conferences, she deliberately did not engage or take any meaningful action to try to remedy or provide her son the help that he so clearly needed. And then we have the causation. So that's a really fancy way of saying but for Jennifer Crumbley's actions, had she not purchased that gun, taken her son to a shooting range, showed him how to, unlock the gun safe that had, I believe the code was 000. If she had not done that, but for that action, those people would still be alive today. And then the final prong, which is the damages prong, which is obviously we have 4 people that lost their lives and 6 others that, not only will have trauma forever, but also have injuries that they're going to have to deal with as well. So when we break it down from a legal standpoint, that is the theory that they brought this case under. This is very new and novel because we typically want to think that, parents, whenever these school shootings have happened, everyone's first question is, well, what did the parents do? What did they not do? What did they let them watch on TV? Did they play too many dangerous video games? We've all theorized what these problems are. We've never actually taken it to the level where we're going to hold a parent criminally responsible for what their child has done. That's going to be interesting. She was actually convicted of all 4 of those charges. Now, another thing to note is that up until recently, both parents were being charged charged together. I think it was a few months ago, once her trial got put on the docket, that they actually split them and severed the cases, which indicates to me from a criminal defense strategy standpoint that they believe, at least for Mr. Crumbley, that the evidence probably is more damning towards Jennifer, and maybe letting her go first and securing that conviction will make things a little bit easier on Mr. Crumbley. So I think that was part of the legal analysis there. Now, when we get into the specifics of this case, I think all of us agree that school shootings are horrible. We might not agree on what the best cause of action is to prevent that. There's a million different options that have been suggested, ranging from gun control to mental health to everything in between. Michigan is actually taking some proactive steps to try to regulate guns, and not in a traditional sense of they're trying to take guns away. What they're trying to do is make it so that a parent can still be held liable if they do certain things, like leave a gun out where a child can get it, not keeping it unloaded in a locked safe where the child can't have access to it. They're trying to enforce accountability on these people so that these things don't happen again. And I think that is good, and it's something we need to get in order. South Carolina, unfortunately, I don't believe has any bills that are proposed that will do anything to monitor this or try to, put some sort of legislation in place that would outline how we in our state would handle it if we did have a similar situation that met these egregious set of facts.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly, if you were trying to imagine a set of facts where a prosecution like this could conceivably be warranted, this case would probably be it. I mean, you mentioned, they supplied the young man with this gun, took him to the range to fire it, clearly did not safeguard it within the home. But also, even more damning than that, you talked about that parent-teacher conference that was actually on the morning of the shooting. And they asked the parents to take the child home. They declined. They asked him to be immediately put into this mental health counseling. They declined. So all of this, again, terrible, aggravating circumstances for these parents. And I just got to say, Lauren, as the father of 7, soon to be 8, if this happened to one of my kids, I would be in search of anyone and everyone who could be held accountable for what happened. But the flip side, as a lover of liberty, as someone who values individual freedom and our system of justice, this still feels like a huge stretch, even with these incredibly glaring, aggravating factors. I can certainly see a wrongful death case at the civil level. I can certainly see some form of negligence, but manslaughter charge for someone who, again, tell me your thoughts on that. I mean, you seem.
I agree. I think it's easy to see it from both sides. So just like you said, if one of your precious children was a victim in a school shooting, you would want to be screaming from the rooftops for any and all people to be held liable. But what if one of your children was the perpetrator in this? And now you have this spotlight that's reflected back on your personal home life, and people asking, well, what did you do wrong? Did you let him read too many magazines, or her? Or, did you not supervise properly? Did you not, provide adequate mental health treatment that they needed? And I think especially in a today, like 2024, so many people are doing the absolute most that they can with the absolute least. We have parents that are trying everything they can to afford daycare to make sure that they can actually go to work, and making that stress that my kid could go do something that I have absolutely no control over, no ability to know every single, as much as we want to say we know and we monitor what our children do on the internet, I think we can all agree that there is no way to tap into every single thing and protect that. And I think you're right. That's an extremely uncomfortable thought to now be sitting here thinking, not only am I going to deal with the horror that my child caused and the loss of life, but my whole family can be at risk because someone could interpret that I had something to do with that. Now, I think obviously that's an extreme scenario. The closest thing, when I was reading about it, was a mother who left her 2 children unattended and locked in a home, and then the home caught on fire, and she was charged with involuntary manslaughter. So I think it's going to be a law the law is going to develop by the facts that are presented. So every situation, when we craft these laws, we're trying to do it in an all-encompassing all-encompassing way so that we can kind of, make sure everyone that's intended to be held accountable under that law actually is. However, in situations like this, it has to be so fact specific, because we cannot allow parents to have that added pressure put on them that, God forbid, their child does do something horrible like this and they didn't know every single resource available to them. Like, people are struggling. We're already in a mental health crisis as a country. To put that extra weight on a parent does seem unfair. Now, it also seems valid if the parent is deliberately not getting mental health treatment and instead providing access to assault, weapons or things that could hurt someone. But it's a balance, and it's not an easy thing to feel good about at night on either side.
Yeah, and again, as you mentioned, this was one of those cases where the facts against, particularly as you mentioned, Jennifer Crumbley, we don't know yet what the case against her husband is going to look like, but certainly the facts against her were just, like I said, if you were going to dream up the ideal case to bring a charge like this, it's hard to imagine one any more open for it than this one. But again, we're in a situation, Lauren, I got to ask you this. I can understand if you have someone that specifically directs someone or helps them plan a shooting or helps enable them after the fact. I can understand charges being brought in those scenarios. But again, with no foreknowledge of this child's actions, it still strikes me as overreach. I did want to read you real quick. This was a federal prosecutor that was quoted in the Detroit Free Press, the paper of record on this story. His name is Michael Bellotta, a former federal prosecutor, but this is what he had to say. These decisions should not be based on emotion or made to appease the voting public. Now, that's what he said. And then I had another quote I wanted to read you here. This is from a Boston University law professor who talked about how this case was an example of using criminalization to try and solve society's problems, namely gun violence. So I wanted to ask you, as we look obviously to the potential precedent that this case could set on individual criminal cases, let me ask you a broader question. Do you think that this case is trying to disincentivize lawful gun ownership in America by creating these new, again, traps for parents if their children somehow get a hold of a weapon and go out and perpetrate a crime like this?
I don't know if I would say it's a trap, but I definitely think that the prosecution saw this particular set of facts, saw that it was as egregious as it was, and capitalized on the opportunity. I mean, a case that could be, a parallel to this is the Brian Laundrie case. Obviously he was not a minor at the time, but his parents, as we're knowing, have participated in the covering up of that crime. Now, that is, like you mentioned, that's an act. That's an overt action. That's not a negligence thing. They participated in helping him clean up a murder. This situation is different. And I mean, with gun reform being such a hot topic, I think we would all be remiss to not know that this is something the other side is going to want to point out. But is it also something that maybe could lead to reasonable legislation instead of trying to take the criminal prosecution route? I think that's something that more people can get on board with, is say, we all agree that we want our children to be safe. We want to prevent school shootings, and we want guns to be in safe places. And if we can get some common sense legislation on the books in all 50 states, that would be great.
Well, Jennifer Crumbley, clearly not the poster mom for doing all you can to keep your child out of this situation. Clearly, again, the facts of this case just awful for her, not even mentioning the fact that there were some indications that they were attempting to flee prior to these charges being brought. They had indicated they were going to turn themselves in at an arraignment. They did not do that. So a lot of factors came into play here. Obviously, that contributed to them being denied bond and imprisoned for the 2 years leading up to this trial earlier this month. Lauren, let me ask you this. As we talk about this justice system here in South Carolina, you mentioned earlier that there are not a lot of laws here on the books in South Carolina that will address this, but let's assume our legislators get together, come up with something. Let's talk a little bit about the judges that will be asked to interpret those laws, to parse those laws, to make decisions regarding cases involving those laws. And there was a big question on the ballot for Republican primary voters in South Carolina this past weekend, and it involved the South Carolina judicial branch of government. I wanted to read it to you real quick. It's something we've talked about. It's something that you and I have spoken about in the past, but it involves the selection of judges. I wanted to read it to you real quick. Should South Carolina adopt reforms to increase the independence and accountability of our judiciary by improving transparency and reducing conflicts of interest in the process of reviewing judicial qualifications and electing judges? Now, that question was put to voters just a few days ago here in South Carolina. 91% said yes. Only 8.8% said no. Were you surprised to see that kind of overwhelming response, Lauren?
I wasn't. I think that, I don't know how many people know this, but South Carolina is actually only one of 2 states that does not allow for constituents to elect their judges. The theory behind that is, if you're a judge that's going to be putting people behind bars, maybe some criminals won't vote for you. But in our state, we have a legislature elected judiciary, which essentially means that anyone that wants to run for a judgeship in the state of South Carolina has to campaign and lobby with the legislators down in Columbia. I think that, there's a lot of reform that needs to happen. A lot of people have gone unchecked in their positions for a long period of time. I think transparency is the first step. A lot of judges have had things happen, recently that we have just kind of not heard anything about. It's died down. I think that is something yearly that should be made available to the public to let them know, how many times has this judge had a grievance filed against them? How many times has the bar complaint been founded? Or at least the ability to know when someone's running for a judge, those statistics, and how have they ever had any issues like that? I think a lot of people that would make amazing jurists in this state are left sitting on the sidelines because they can't compete in the game of politics. And I think anytime that we leave good people with integrity and a willingness to serve the public in this role, we're doing our state a disservice.
I could not agree with you more on that. That is absolutely true. So many people just don't want to sully themselves and get in the muck with some of these political types. Let me ask you this, Lauren. Let's say you're queen for the day here in the Palmetto State. I think we'd all be better off if that were the case. Let me ask you this. What system would you implement if it were up to you here in the Palmetto State?
Say that one more time. What strategies?
Yeah, sure. What system of judicial selection would you implement here in South Carolina if it were up to you?
Oh gosh, well, can I solve world peace at the same time or world hunger?
It might be easier.
I think that, like I said, I think it starts with transparency. I think some people, they send out these things to lawyers. They ask us, do you know anything about this person? And they tell us that these are anonymous surveys. I'll tell you that I don't know if they're anonymous. I'm not the person reading them. And, I've filled them out before. And I have personally hesitated about saying anything negative about certain people because I don't want to have any risk of that wrath coming back towards me or maybe possibly affecting my clients in a negative way. And I think that is something that might not go away if we do have regular elections for judges, right? Like when people are in elected positions of power, that doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden ethical, good, upstanding citizens who are going to apply the law the way that they should, right? We've seen that happen plenty of times. But I think it would at least allow the public to feel some control over these decisions. Like I practice a lot in family court. These judges are deciding literal lives. Who's going to live with who? How are we going to split up houses and retirement accounts and children and visitation? When a judge is sitting up there that doesn't know you and doesn't know your spouse and is making rulings that are going to not just impact you, but your kids for the foreseeable future, you want to know who that person is. You want to know that they're a good person. You want to know that they act in accordance with the law. And you want to have some faith that if they don't, there's a remedy. And I think that is the big gap that we're trying to face right now is there's a lot going on behind the curtain and they don't want to pull the curtain back. I'm not saying everything, that's going on is wrong, but we have to pull the curtain back to be able to see what the problems are before we can really dig into how to fix it.
Well, we've gotten the lawmakers to at least acknowledge that there's the perception of a problem.
Right.
Getting them to acknowledge the actual problem hopefully will be the next step. But it was certainly nice as somebody who has been pushing for many years to try to fix this system, make it more transparent, make it more fair, make it more accountable. It was nice to see such an overwhelming response there at the polls last week, at least on the Republican side. Lauren, before you go, let me ask you this. I know that you've been tracking a lot of the true crime cases that are unfolding here in South Carolina. There's a big hearing coming up in the fall for Susan Smith. Obviously, this is a case that attracted national and international attention here in South Carolina long before the Murdaugh murders. That was the trial of the century for the 20th century when Susan Smith was convicted of the murder of her 2 children. But she is petitioning for release in November. Lauren, you know a little bit about this case, but you got any thoughts on, is Susan Smith going to get out? What do you think is going to happen at that hearing up in York County later this year?
I think that Susan Smith was someone that I remember that case, and I was, much younger than I should have been to know what was going on there. I think it's still something that resonates in the South Carolinians' minds and hearts that was such a gruesome, horrible crime. I don't know. I would be surprised if she was released, and if she is, I think she has an interesting life awaiting her on the outside, especially with people still feeling, the feelings that they feel towards her. And, the crime itself was just horrific. And I think one of the first, cases we saw where a mother, killed her 2 children at that point. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to follow along.
Well, we've got that coming up this fall. We've got a couple of other big brutal homicide cases that we've been covering. We've got one up in Anderson County, a quadruple homicide. We had some bond hearings on that earlier this month. And obviously we've got that big rose petal murder case up in Greenville. Really hope you'll come back on, Lauren, and help us dig through the legal minutia of all those cases. And just can't thank you enough for your willingness to help inform our readers on the legal facts of all these cases. And your analysis has just been so helpful.
Of course. Thanks, Will. I'm happy to help anytime.
All right, everybody. Lauren Taylor, can't wait to have her on again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Will.